we are on a fast track to climate disaster. Major cities underwater, unprecedented heat waves, terrifying storms, widespread water shortages, the extinction of 1 million species of plants and animals. And this is not fiction or exaggeration. It is what science tells us will result from our current energy policies. We are on a pathway to global warming of more than double the 1.5 degree limit agreed in Paris. Some government and business leaders are saying one thing but doing another. Simply put, they are lying. And the results will be catastrophic. This is a climate emergency. Climate scientists warn that we are already perilously close to tipping points that could lead to cascading and irreversible climate impacts. But high-emitting governments and corporations are not just turning a blind eye. They are adding fuel to the flames. They are choking our planet based on their vested interests and historic investments in fossil fuels, when cheaper, renewable solutions provide green jobs, energy security, and greater price stability.
The climate change conversation began as early as the 1970s, and the topic is more so relevant and important to discuss now more than ever. Welcome to People on Earth. Joining me in the studio today are two prominent personalities on the environment and climate change issues. Commissioner Veronica Gundu Jakarasi, the Forestry Commission Board Chairperson and a climate financing expert. Mr. Tendai Govamombe, a communications expert specializing on climate change and the environment. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Makanaka.
Sure. So to begin our program, climate change is now a topical issue across the globe. What is climate change? And why is it important for the country to prioritize climate action programs?
Thank you very much, Kanaka, with regards to that question. So in terms of climate change, we are looking at unprecedented climatic weather patterns which are now visible across the globe. Long back, climate change has been there, but what has been happening is that in terms of the visibility, it has been lacking. But over the recent times, I think you can tell right now that almost everyone is now aware of what is happening with regards to these unprecedented climatic weather conditions. So with regards to what is happening in Zimbabwe, I'm sure you are aware of what has been happening over the past few years, the flash floods in Matabeleland North, the likes of flash floods in Binga, the drought spells across some parts of Zimbabwe, the likes of Masvingo, Bowera, and of course the cyclone Idai that ravaged some parts in Chimanimani, Mutare, and Chipinge and others. So because of that kind of a predicament, it now forces us probably as a country and countries of the globe now to act so that we save our country, we save our lives from these climate vagaries.
Sure.
Yes.
So talking about popular terms in climate change, we have heard of global warming, climate change adaptation and mitigation. What do these mean to laymen? I mean, people from home, they want to understand. What do these terms really mean?
Thank you very much with regards to that aspect. I'm sure one thing which I need also to address is that climate change is a scientific field. Therefore, us, like myself, coming from the media fraternity, we try by all means to make our own researches, to try to understand some of these issues around this subject area, so that when we convey this message to a layman, it can be translated well in a manner that is that is so simple, that is clear. So as for me, in terms of climate change adaptation, we are now looking at what we can do to cope with the current changes in terms of the climatic conditions or the shocks. Then when it comes to mitigation, what can we do now to make sure that whatever is causing whatever is the major attribute of climate change, we can reduce it, we can, reduce the impacts and the likes. So that's what we'll be looking at in terms of these two terms. So at first, at personal level, I used to think that these two terms, they are merely the same, at times, confusing between the two. But with time, due to investment in terms of research and the likes, you come to understand now to say mitigation is a sector on its own, then adaptation is something that is different from mitigation. Yes.
Sure. So, Commissioner Veronica probably would want to shed more light on these terms in your words. What do they really mean?
Thank you very much, Makanaka. In terms of climate change mitigation, discussing from a climate change perspective, it largely speaks to greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And when you talk of greenhouse gases, you're talking of your carbon dioxide, your methane, your nitrogen gases, and your hydrofluorocarbons. So we are then saying, what are the technologies that are available that can reduce these gases from the atmosphere or from going into the atmosphere? So we have technologies like replacement of coal, maybe using solar, and then we can also have afforestation, where we are then using natural sequestration of the trees to take in carbon dioxide and then give us the oxygen that we want. So that on its own is the essence of mitigation in terms of how do we technically reduce the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere so that they don't contribute to global warming. And then in terms of adaptation, as he has already said, we're looking at what are the coping strategies? We face floods, we face droughts. So what are the activities that can narrow or reduce the exposure to shocks and the challenges that we face as a result of climate change? So for example, in terms of coping with the drought, you can then use an irrigation system as a coping and adaptation strategy to the drought impact.
Okay, so having said that, how are these applicable in the local context, these terms?
I've already tried to give practical examples in terms of the replacement factor. For example, your solar to generate energy vis-a-vis the high emitting fossil fuels. So even in houses, we can see where we used to use kerosene historically in our rural areas to do lighting, and we moved to solar home systems and solar lamps. So now lighting has become more sustainable, it's become more cleaner. So that is the whole essence when you look at the whole development space and climate mitigation from a day-to-day living. And then the aspect of irrigation when you're coping with the drought, how do we afford to have productive sector or production throughout the year, yet we are rain-fed. So we then use irrigation to be able to produce throughout the year, regardless of whether we have the rains or not. So that actually supports your adaptive capacity and contributes to food security as a country.
Sure. So coming to you, probably you'd want to shed more light on how these terms are applicable in our local context.
Okay, in terms of the applicability with regards to our local context, I think I'm going to explain this from a media point of view, from a communications personnel, where we try to simplify these terms in a manner which is well understandable to to various communities across the sectors, laymen sectors, government departments, be it official and individual and the likes. So in terms of how we can now translate these terms with regards to the local context, in terms of adaptation, like I said earlier on, Zimbabwe has been is still prone to these climate change vagaries, ravaging various communities and the likes. So in terms of adaptation now, we are now looking at more like the steps which are being taken by the government to educate the public, to assist those communities so that they can withstand those unprecedented climatic weather conditions, those shocks.
Sure.
Yes. Then when it comes to mitigation now, mitigation is a little bit broader, but I would say, like she said, she was explaining from a point of view of an expert with regards to that subject area. But now in terms of adaptation, in terms of mitigation, we are saying the country's position with regards to the mechanisms or the ways which they put in place to reduce those greenhouse emissions.
Sure.
Probably they can be focusing on various sectors. They can be focusing on energy sector, reducing emissions from the industry sector, reducing emissions from the agricultural sector, among other sectors as well.
Okay,
yes.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I hope people are learning from home really these terms, because they're quite complicated. People just talk about climate change, they don't know what it is, and I appreciate you trying to shed more light in the most simple terms. We are going to take a short break. Join us after the break. Welcome back to People on Earth. Before the break, we defined what climate change is and how some of the terms within the climate change context are applicable in the local context. Now, I come to you again. Looking at international commitments and obligations, Zimbabwe is a party to the Paris Agreement on Climate. Can you tell us what the agreement is all about?
Okay, thank you very, very much with regards to that question. Right, in terms of how I understand it, I'm sure she's going to explain it further, but I just want to briefly explain so that it's something that comes with clarity in terms of from a layman point of view. Right, so Zimbabwe is a signatory to what is known as the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. So as a country that is part of that agreement is binding to all the member states to say that we are consenting to reduce the global greenhouse gas emissions, and there are targets that are set. So with regards to that, currently countries of the globe, because of that agreement, they are now working towards completing their pledges so that they can be in a position to tackle this climate change both at a local level and at a global level. Yes.
Sure. Commissioner Veronica, probably you'd want to shed more light what this agreement is all about.
Yes, thank you very much. I think I was privileged to be part of the negotiators in Paris in 2015 when this agreement was negotiated. What is really exciting about the agreement, it tries to be holistic, to cover what we have just previously discussed in terms of mitigation and adaptation, but it then also talks around the issues of climate finance. So on mitigation, we are guided by the temperature goal, where we are intending to reduce the global to keep the global temperature below 2 degrees and subsequently 1.5. And in terms of adaptation is to ensure that we build resilience among communities. So it's about how do we slow the impacts or avoid the impacts of climate change in affecting livelihoods of communities. And then the third goal of the Paris Agreement is the one on climate finance, where we are saying the resources mobilized to support low emissions development and resilience building, how do we make them flow in a way that it is equitable to support the development that we want? So there are basically 3 goals of the Paris Agreement, focusing on mitigation, adaptation, and climate finance flows.
Okay, so what is Zimbabwe's commitment to the agreement and our key priority areas?
We submitted a revised NDC, which is your nationally determined contribution. And somebody will ask, what is a nationally determined contribution? So what we are basically saying is there was a Kyoto Protocol before the Paris Agreement was signed. But the Kyoto Protocol was largely for developed countries, mandating them to reduce their emissions. But we also saw other developing countries largely becoming major polluters, such as our sister or from China, where they had their emissions increasing. So as a result, they then said, why don't we have everybody on board to try and develop more sustainably to ensure that they reduce their emissions and they develop in a way that does not harm the environment. As a result, parties then decided to agree on the Paris Agreement. And when we agreed on the Paris Agreement, they then said, okay, we are not going to impose on you how much of the emissions you're going to reduce, how much you're going to contribute towards a sustainable and clean environment. You tell us what you can do. So that's why it is said it is a nationally determined. So it is country established, country determined. And then you say, this is my contribution as Zimbabwe. So as Zimbabwe, we submitted a nationally determined contribution looking at 40% emissions reduction in the wider economy per capita below business as usual, and which is more ambitious from the previous NDC that was submitted, which largely was looking at two sectors that are agriculture and energy. And by then, we're only focusing at reducing 33% of our emissions below business as usual in terms of the energy per capita emissions. So I think that is very quite forward-looking and ambitious.
Okay, so what does it take to be a climate change negotiator?
To be a climate change negotiator, firstly, it's the technical know-how in terms of understanding the issues that are being discussed in the climate space. And the exciting part about climate change is that the issues are very broad. So you don't need only to be an environmentalist or a climate change expert. When it comes to climate change negotiations, we are looking at people in the engineering space that focus on emissions reduction. We are also looking at the legal aspects that are important in drafting the negotiations. We are also focusing at your environmentalists and climate experts, but we are also looking even at agriculture experts, because when you look at climate change, it has the cross-cutting nature that it has, just like gender. So you then say, in agriculture, who is the expert? Do they understand the issues of emissions reduction, development? In industry, so anyone in their field, whether you're an accountant, you can be relevant in the climate change space. I guess then you'll be following climate finance, because then you also want to know how much of the resources are flowing into climate finance in terms of supporting green development, renewable investments, and sustainable and cleaner technologies.
Okay, sure. So still on international participation, Africa Climate Week was recently held in Gabon, and COP27 is set to take place in Egypt in November. Why is it important for the country to attend these forums?
Thank you very much. I was actually telling some colleagues that until you make a strategic decision to develop, some of these meetings may not be relevant. The reason why we attend those meetings as a country is to understand the direction of global development, is also to understand the essence of multilateralism. For example, if you look at climate change, we cannot address it on our own as Zimbabwe, and we need the global village to address the impacts of climate change. So the reason why we participate in these negotiations is also to understand how development is looking like, what are the emerging issues. They are currently talking about trade. Are we going to be affected by carbon trading, externalities? So all those issues are very important as a country to understand. We are talking of just transition, where we are moving from fossil fuels to more sustainable energy technologies. What does it mean to Zimbabwe? How do we inform our energy mix in that front? So
Sure.
all those issues are very pertinent for Zimbabwe to understand, so that even as we develop our blueprint, it helps us to understand what are the next spaces to consider in the development space.
Sure, indeed. So it is important for a country to actually attend such conferences. Thank you very much for watching People on Earth. Let's take a short break. We will be right back. Welcome back to People on Earth. Before the break, we were discussing on COP27, the climate change conference, which is set to take place in Egypt. And Commissioner Veronica was explaining to us the importance of a country such as Zimbabwe to attend such a conference. So now Tendai, in this final segment of the program, on a parting shot, is Zimbabwe in the right direction in terms of addressing climate change?
Thank you very much for that question. I think our country is doing tremendous work with regards to the need to respond to climate change. Firstly, earlier on we were talking about international commitments, which Zimbabwe is a signatory to a number of conventions that happened at global level. That alone, it shows that the government is doing something that's a rightful direction. Then coming back at home, there are a number of pieces of legislation which the government has put in place in terms of trying to address this aspect. Because when you want to address something, you don't just go by the means of wanting to address simply because we are encountering a challenge or a problem, but you address from a point of a legislative framework. So there are a number of legislative frameworks which speaks to climate change, the likes of the National Adaptation Plan. We talk of in terms of energy, there are a number of policies that have been put in place, and the likes of renewable energy policies, the likes of energy efficiency. All those documents are speaking to one thing, so that we can adapt, we can also mitigate these impacts of climate change. So from a personal point of view, Zimbabwe is taking the rightful direction. So what I would want to probably urge is to say, from a media perspective, we just need to continue raising awareness, more awareness and more awareness, so that communities become more aware and well-versed with regards to what is happening in terms of climate change, and what they are also expected to do in terms of those aspects.
Commissioner, do you think that Zimbabwe is doing enough to address climate change?
Thank you very much. I think we've made significant strides following the establishment of the Climate Change Department in 2014, where we saw the formulation of the National Climate Change Strategy, the development of the National Climate Policy, and we now have significant enabling documents to drive the climate change agenda. I think now what we need is to make significant strides in mobilizing adequate climate financing for actual implementation of climate change activities, both for mitigation and for adaptation. And what I think can be doable is to say, let us design and understand the role of the private sector in the climate change space, and let us allow the designing of programs to be more integrated, to be more robust, and also to be gender responsive, because we understand that the impacts of climate change are not gender neutral. So bringing in the centric of gender responsiveness in programming is also fundamental. I think there is significant work that has been done, but I believe that we can do more and we can do better.
Okay, sure. So what will be your call to our viewers and to all Zimbabweans regarding climate change?
As the Commissioner of the Forestry Commission, firstly is let's go planting trees. It is one of the sophisticated technologies in sequestering carbon dioxide and addressing the climate challenge. And it brings a lot of benefits just beyond sequestering carbon. In terms of your fruit trees, you're looking at food security, food systems diversification, you're looking at nutrition as well. So I believe that planting trees will be a good start for us.
Sure. And to you, what would be your call to our viewers and to all Zimbabweans regarding climate change?
Thank you so much for that. So my last message for the viewers is to say the change is real and everyone has to act. And by the manner of acting, we are also preparing for the future of the future generation and the likes. So, if we have discussed earlier on, climate change is impacting almost every sector, if we are to look at our SDGs, climate change being on a SDG number 12, again it is impacting on other, it is also complementing other SDGs, the likes of SDG on food and security to end hunger, addressing issues to do with water. Again, it's coming back to climate change. Issues of energy, it's coming back to climate change. Vulnerable groups, it's coming back to climate change. So hence, this is a significant topic which everyone needs to know. And from a media fraternity point of view, yes, everyone has to seek that knowledge. They have to know. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Gubamombe, and indeed, Commissioner Veronica, thank you very much for sharing with us on such a very important topic. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today. We hope you keep the conversation going on climate change and spread the knowledge you have gained from watching the show today. See you again next time, same time, same place, and remember to stay green.